So I don't know about you all, but it seems to me like there's seasons in life where the big kinds of questions bubble to the surface. You know what I'm talking about when I say that? And I think right now we kind of are in one of those seasons. And maybe it's, I don't know, the change in seasons, the cooling weather, or the political climate that we've just kind of been through. But I've been having a lot of conversations with a lot more people that reveal that there's a lot of soul searching going on right now. And I think one of the biggest questions that we have and that we deal with is the question that impacts every minute of every day. And that is, who is God? Like most of the other big questions in life, there's no way to simply explain who God is to someone else. Because for each of us, if we're seeking God, we'll constantly learn new things through both the Word and through our experiences with God. So in our fast food culture, it's a challenge for us to help others walk this path that we know doesn't always have clear answers or directions. God is too powerful. He's too good, and He's too knowing for us to fully comprehend while still inhabiting these bodies, right? So learning who God is less of a destination and more of a journey, and that's a metaphor that we use a lot. So today we're going to continue through Exodus with the intention of uncovering one more facet of who our God is, so that we can first better know God for ourselves. And so secondly, we can better walk with others as they seek to know who God is. So this leaves us with the question then of why am I entitling the sermon, Saved, Who Am I? That wasn't a typo. But you're just going to have to wait to see how it all works together. So last week, we left off with Moses at the moment when he was given his name by his Egyptian foster mother. The scriptures tell us that he was given the name Moses because the daughter of Pharaoh drew him out of the water. And this is consistent with the Hebrew meaning of that name. But there's another meaning that rests underneath that one. Because the word Moses sounds like the Egyptian word for son. And this word was often tagged onto the back of another word to define who the child's father was, like Tutmos, Ramos. Ramos means born of or son of Ra. So we have this child of Hebrew descent, nursed by his Hebrew mother, which would mean that he was understood to have been nourished into the Hebrew culture, suddenly brought into the Egyptian pharaohs, the oppressor's household, named for the otherworldly and mysterious aquatic environment where he was found and drawn out of, and given a name to the Egyptians that sounded essentially like son of, with no sense of an anchoring identity or a father's or a family's name. And he grew up in the household for what most scholars agree is around 40 years before we as readers are given another piece of this story. In our Bibles, Exodus 2:10 ends with his naming, and verse 11 begins one day after Moses had grown up. So we're left wondering what this strange mix of identities has done to this baby who is Hebrew by birth and Egyptian by upbringing. We don't have to wait long, though, because in Exodus 2:11-13, it gives us an extremely condensed story of how these two identities that Moses carries conflict in a startling moment of choice for Moses. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now that's a lot of information in these two little verses. But we have to ask the question that plagues this entire section of the Bible. Is our author writing a hero story with hindsight, or is our author speaking from the limited perspective of the man of God who is developing into the Moses, the deliverer we know from the end of the story? And this will make a difference for us as we read these chapters. For example, we learn that Moses knows his heritage and that he identifies with the Hebrews because the author tells us that he went out to his people. But our author would have probably used the same language even if he had been telling the story looking back at what the hero Moses had done. So we have to answer the question, did he go out to his people already identifying with them, or did he go out to his people as an Egyptian and only later understand that those people are truly his people? Because this will change the way that we read about Moses. For me, I look at the next verse, which tells us that he looked this way and that before he struck the Egyptian. In other words, he's making a choice here. He didn't go out with a plan to begin defeating Egypt. He was responding to what he saw as an injustice. So as we go through this story, this is the sense that we're going to read it with. And reading it in this way, we know that God gives us this account for a number of reasons. But one of those is it allows us to see Moses not in a rosy-hued, there we go, victory lap against the Egyptians, but as someone who has a lot to learn about God and their own identity and their responsibilities and how God takes who he made us to be, our inborn traits, and shapes us so that we can help in God's mission to shape the world so that once again it reflects God's goodness. So we don't have an intentional Moses working for God's purposes at this point, but more of a developing one, as uncertain as we all are as we're moving through this life, trying to grapple with injustice and the things in the world that simply don't make sense, and then figure out what we're supposed to do about them. And this 40-year-old Hebrew who was raised an Egyptian, with all the comforts of living in a royal household, somehow has his eyes opened to the fact that his kinsfolk are suffering under forced labor. And in this one particular case, the Egyptian was beating a Hebrew slave. Now, although our translations read that the Egyptian was beating the Hebrew and then Moses killed the Egyptian, the word for both beating and killed is the same Hebrew word that might be better translated as strike. So there's a sense that Moses was doing to the Egyptian exactly what the Egyptian was doing to the Hebrew, which is important because this tiny little story right at the beginning is telling us that Moses, by nature, is wired to see injustice and to do something about it. And I love this because how often do we see injustices and sit back and wonder if others see the same thing? And then we wrestle for a moment over if we're supposed to do something. And then sometimes when we take action, it doesn't have the desired effect. And we can blame others for that and think that our eyes were the ones that were open to what God wanted to do. Or we can question ourselves and wonder if we actually heard from God. Or, and this is what I think we can take from these simple verses, we can look at the situation and realize that there might be something in that for us to learn and to develop. Because while Moses had the right motivation, justice, it wasn't time yet. So we have an Egyptian buried in the sand and a Moses who walked away from what he had done. But standing on the outside looking in, this doesn't seem very smart. Doesn't seem very smart to bury somebody in the sand, guys, does it? No. I mean, word's going to get out. At the very least, the Hebrew he saved would probably do some talking. And immediately, verses 13 to 15, when he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now, there are a few things I want to point out here, and they all have to do with the question of where Moses belongs. You see, Moses' authority over the Hebrew slaves is challenged, and they challenge him in a way that cuts right to the heart of the problem. Who are you? Moses asked them why they were fighting against each other, which reveals Moses' immaturity. He didn't ask why the Egyptian and the Hebrew had been fighting the day before, because that was obvious. There's an oppressor and an oppressed. But this one he can't figure out. But we all know with a little life experience that conflict crops up even in populations who share pain, right? And this truth that he partially learns here will play out again and again as he eventually leads the Israelites out of slavery and into the desert. So it reads almost as if Moses, having fought for justice the day before because of the security in his adopted identity as an Egyptian raised in the Pharaoh's household, it's almost as if he feels that he's now somehow able to dispense justice. And these Hebrews are like, oh, aren't you cute? Who do you think you are? Because you certainly don't have the authority to speak into this situation. They didn't appreciate the implied judgment. And they strike back by questioning his identity, as well as bringing up Moses' newfound and very real insecurity because he'd just killed the Egyptian, and people know. So a lot of things happen very quickly, the result of which Moses learns that he's not accepted as one of the Hebrews, even though he protected one of them. And now he's been rejected by Pharaoh, so he flees to the land of Midian and sits by a well. In a matter of only a few verses, Moses is in a foreign land as a 40-year-old man who lacks a sense of who he is. He has just traveled through the desert, and now he comes to a well. And wells in this time and culture were central to life. It was a place of relief from the heat and also a place of community. We see throughout the Bible the setting of a well repeated in times of uncertainty or when there's going to be change. And there are similarities every time we see wells in the Bible. One of the similarities is that they usually go there to meet the opposite gender, and then they get married. Think about it, how many times that happens in the Bible. We should put a well out here for the singles. But one commentator pointed out that while these interactions are so predictable that what we can take away from these well scenes is often most easily exposed by what's missing from the story. So we have Moses sitting down by a well, and I don't have time to read the entire account, but the priest of Midian's 7 daughters meet him as they come to draw water for the day. And while they're there, some shepherds enter the scene and drive the women's flocks away from the source of water. Moses, almost predictably at this point, comes to their defense and waters their flocks for them. But the thing that's missing in this well scene is that there is never an introduction. Moses never tells them his name. And when the women go back to their father and explain why they have returned so early from the well, they tell their father that an Egyptian helped them. An Egyptian. So as readers, we know that what we're supposed to take away is that Moses is moving through life with no sense of who he is and no home. But the priest of Midian welcomes him and gives him one of his daughters in marriage, and Moses becomes a shepherd for his father-in-law. And while we're not given a timeline here, we know that it's about 40 more years before the next scene is developed. 40 years of living as an exile from his home in Egypt. 40 years of knowing that the people of his blood are being held in bondage. 40 years of living in an adopted identity of a Midianite because being an Egyptian and being a Hebrew didn't work out. 40 years of living, knowing that he was given up by his mother and rejected by his adoptive family. And he would have known his mother, that his mother didn't have a choice in that, but there would have still been pain. 40 years. And I want to read this next section of scripture for you, Exodus 3, 1 through 5. Moses was keeping the flock in his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. So we have an 80-year-old man here at this point, caring for his father-in-law's flock of sheep. You see, after growing up in a privileged royal household for the first 40 years of his life, for the next 40, Moses had been learning humility. And at 80, he's not distinguished by any means. He's never even had the answer to the question of who he really is. He would have known who his father was, but not known him, never lived with him, never learned from him. And in this culture, your identity is based on your father's line. And the last conversation that we read that he had with a Hebrew was when they literally asked him who he was. And his Egyptian family wanted him dead. So when we enter this scene, we're not really supposed to be impressed with Moses. He's just a normal person who had a very interesting start to his life. But at this point, we see that he led his flock beyond the boundaries of the wilderness to Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, where a bush blazes but isn't consumed by the flame. And you can almost see this scene. We have an old man who spent half of his life literally and figuratively wandering, patiently following sheep, content to live and die as a man whose name sounds like half a name, only son with no father's name to anchor it, a foreigner in a foreign land. And suddenly, as he approaches the mountain that rises up out of the wilderness that has been his home, he stumbles on a supernatural fire burning. But remember, our Moses, even before he has a sense of who he is, he's brave. He stands up to injustice, not based out of any authority given to him because of his identity, but because it's right. And he had to learn patience and who knows what other skills in his decades of life. But the fact that he stands unapologetically for the good speaks to his courage. So instead of running away, he investigates the space where heaven and earth have met. And God calls to him in a way that, having walked through the book of Genesis, is now familiar to us. God says, Moses, Moses, repeating the name that has been given to him by his adopted mother. This kind of repetition in this culture and time is understood as a sign of affection or friendship. So Moses knows that the one who's calling him is one who loves him and is familiar with him, which is so incredible. Our God gives us what we need. Even when it's something like calling us in a way that we recognize, meeting us in the familiar, because what's important to us is also important to God. And our God loves to give us gifts, even the little ones, like knowing we are seen and that we're known. And I think there's beauty in this, and it's easy to miss. God calls us by our name because no matter what is attached to that name, no matter if there is pain there or a sense that we never belonged, no matter if that name came from people who knew us and loved us or it came from people we never knew, God knows us, and that name means something. It means something to God. And this is just a little simple aside, but maybe you're sitting here this morning and the name that you carry reminds you of a painful part of your life. Maybe your family name is a name that no longer means family. Maybe it never meant family. Maybe you feel like your name carries no meaning. And I want to tell you that it means something to God because it carries all of the things, the hurt and the joys, all of the things that make you you. But it also carries the future that you can't imagine is even there. I think when God speaks our names, the hurt that might have been associated with that name will dissolve because God turns all things to good. The pain is leached away because in the light of God's goodness, it's so complete that the darkness has no hope and no power and no authority over the future that God has ordained for you. So God uses the name that likely holds little meaning for Moses and tells him to remove the sandals from his feet because where he is standing is holy. Now in Jewish tradition, holy ground doesn't exist because of what they do or because it's been set aside. It's holy because God has been there. When the temple is built, the Holy of Holies is designated as such because that is the place where God's presence would dwell. When we sing that we're standing on holy ground, it's not our hope that God will meet us here or out of reverence for what God can be or what God will do. When we sing that we're standing on holy ground, it's because we have recognized that the ordinary has been turned into the extraordinary because God has been in this place and God's presence has sanctified it and made it holy. When we sing that we're standing on holy ground, it's because we know that when God's Spirit fills this place, everything changes. And the room that we stood in seconds ago is no longer the same place. The carpet's not the same, the chairs are not the same, the air is not the same, and we're not the same. When God's holiness fills the room, we stand as those who are not worthy, but have been made worthy through the cleansing blood of Jesus. And we stand in wonder and gratitude because while we can't explain it, we can know it. Just like while we can't explain God, we can know God. So Moses walks through the ordinariness of his life. Is ordinariness a word? I don't even know. It is now. Up an ordinary path at the base of Sinai, where so much has and will take place, and investigates what should be an ordinary bush, but it burns with God's sanctifying, cleansing presence. And this is before Jesus, so there's no cleansing of his sins, no way for Moses to be safely in the presence of holiness. So God tells him to take off his shoes, and Moses hides his face. But in God's graciousness, God introduces himself not by confirming who he is, but by confirming Moses' identity. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So God calls Moses' name twice, telling him automatically that he is safe and he is loved. And then he tells him that he knows him more than any other human ever could because he knows who he is. He knows Moses' true identity. In the space of a breath, Moses is suddenly, and for the first time in his life, known. And this is so simple but so easy to overlook. All day long, we take on so many different identities. We are sons and daughters and parents and friends and employees and musicians and artists and accountants. And then we are happy or lazy or sad or stubborn or patient. But when we kneel at the altar, everything else fades, and we are who God says we are. And we know it immediately. There are a lot of things that draw us to this place, but I think when we're describing sitting in God's presence to someone who might not know the power inherent in the altar, sometimes we forget the simplest and most elemental. Here in the presence, on holy ground, we are known. That's who we are. And I can't imagine what it must have felt like for Moses after 80 years. He is suddenly known. Maybe that's what you need. To be known, to be seen. I want to say today that God is here and we're standing on holy ground. But God's Spirit isn't neutral. We can't come into the presence of God and remain unchanged, because when we open ourselves to God's presence, we suddenly begin to see things in the way that God sees them. We see the injustices, we see the hurt, we see the work that needs to be done, and sometimes, like for Moses, God gives us something specific. Exodus 3:7-12 says, "Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." You see, once in God's presence, we are instantly tasked with what concerns God. And sometimes, I think if we're honest, the reason that we're not at the altar is because we're afraid of what God's going to ask us to do. I'm going to say that again. Sometimes I think the reason we're not at the altar is because we're afraid of what God's going to ask us to do. I need to tell you today, we are a people who identify ourselves by the name of our God. Bravery to step into what that identity means is not optional. It's not optional. But our weakness is understood. And I love how God handles this. Moses may be out of feelings of insecurity or inadequacy, or maybe just expressing the profound gulf between who he is and who God is. After being told what needed to be accomplished, all of the wonderful things that would happen out of his obedience, immediately he reverts to that old insecurity. The question that the Hebrews asked him 40 years ago before he fled to Egypt: who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And God, having already told Moses who he is, responds simply and so profoundly. God says, "I will be with you. I will be with you." Did you notice that God didn't answer his question? It's because the answer didn't matter. When Satan wants us to question who we are in God, our answer that it doesn't matter who we are, because what matters is who we follow. What matters is who we worship. What matters is who we are loved by. What matters is that we are a child of the King. So God loved Moses enough to call him by the name he was known by, but in the next breath, God loves him enough to let him know that the name that he was given or the name that he wasn't given never really mattered anyway. And then in the same sentence, he gives Moses hope and a vision for what God will accomplish through him, so that when God has set the Israelites free from Egypt, they will together worship God on the ground that God's presence has made holy. Chapter 3 continues after God had told Moses his plan, but it doesn't continue like we might expect. Instead of Moses gathering his things and preparing to do the work for the Lord, we as readers have to walk with him through 4 objections that he gives to God. 4 of them. There is a bush on fire that's not burning. Sometimes it takes us a while and a lot of work on God's part for us to trust him. The first one is recorded in Exodus 3:13. But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' they will ask me, 'What is his name?' What shall I say to them?" God's response follows in verse 14. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" Another translation of "I am who I am" is "I will be who I will be." I think sometimes we get stuck on the power of this verse and the statement that God, when God says he is the I am, and there is power there, but it's actually the clarification in the next verse, I think, where the real power is. Because in verse 15, God says, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations.'" And I say that the power is here for one reason. In our English translations, the word Lord, in all capital letters usually, signifies something wholly different from the word God. The word God is a designation, a recognition of a creator that stands outside of everything else that has been created. But when we read Lord in all capital letters, that's to tell us that in Hebrew, we are reading the name Yahweh. In this time period and culture, the idea of knowing someone's name signified that you possessed some power over them. We can read many, many, many ancient myths where the plot centered around people needing to discover the name of a god so that they could accomplish some task. And this even lives on in old but more recent stories of ours, like Rumpelstiltskin. So when Moses asks God for his name to give the Israelites, and God responds with vulnerability and offers his personal name, it's saying that this God is not like any other gods. This God is a good God. This God is a trusting God. This God is one who will walk with them through the desert. This God is one who wants to dwell with them, to have a relationship with them. This God is a God who cares. And this God who cares, Yahweh, then gives Moses further instructions. Exodus 3:16-22. "Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have given heed to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt. I declare that I will bring you up out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us now go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, so we may sacrifice to the Lord our God.'" I know, however, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all of my wonders that I will perform in it. After that, he will let you go. I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman living in the neighbor's house for jewelry of silver and of gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, so that you shall plunder the Egyptians. That's a pretty good map. I don't know about you, but after reading this, I'm expecting Moses to be like, let's ride at dawn, for real. But instead, he answers in Exodus 4:1. But suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you. So God, being patient and knowing who Moses is, responds by giving Moses the power to perform miracles like turning a staff into a snake and back again, or turning water from the Nile into blood. So as readers, we're like, now for sure, Moses is ready to go, right? Nope. Exodus 4:10, "O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." To which God replies in verses 11 and 12, "Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth." I'll be with your mouth. And God's getting pretty specific. "And teach what you are to speak." So now for sure Moses is ready to go, right? Nope. "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." And I think that this is one of my favorite responses in the Bible, is in Exodus 4:14-17. "Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, 'What of your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak fluently. Even now he's coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach. Wait! You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak to you for the people, and he shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as a God for him. Take your hand and your staff with which you shall perform the signs." I think one of the reasons that I appreciate this response so much is because we see that God gets angry, but God's anger is never unjustified, and it's always productive. There's just so much reality in this interaction. When we began with Moses being told to take off his shoes because he's on holy ground, and God teaching him how to be in God's presence in only a few verses, God and Moses are having a conversation, because while our God is entirely sovereign and holy and infinitely powerful, and so foreign to our understanding, God will relate to us on our level. God will feel the emotions that we feel, and God will respond with what we need. We serve a God who loves us, who knows us, and who still wants a relationship with us, even when we experience his power at the altar and then walk out of these doors and doubt the breakthrough that God has just given us. And later when we read on, we'll see how God uses this man who was without identity, humbled and rejected by his own people, to solidify the identity and unify an entire nation to fulfill God's covenantal promise. So today, worship team, you can come back on up. If you've entered this place with the question, "Who am I?" smoldering at the edges of your mind, bringing into question your value, or if you're asking, "Who am I that God would use me?" God would say to you that it doesn't matter who you are, it only matters who God is. So the answer to who am I, the answer to our insecurities, our disappointments, our failures, is in the journey to learning who our God is. And God is the Father, the Redeemer, the friend, the one who'll call you by name, but then in the same breath tell you that you don't stand alone. We're preparing to do some big things here at Bedrock Church, and it's going to take an army of people who step out of who they are and step into not just who God makes them, but step into the reality that the only thing that matters is who God is. A whole church filled with believers who are ready to set aside their doubts based on human limitations and embrace the provision of Yahweh. I'd like to invite you to stand if you can. So most Sundays I try to leave you with something to do or to incorporate into your life. But this week, I just want to take a few moments to be in God's presence.